trachea because the trachea is always wide open with a big wide open lumen, and the esophagus is always collapsed. So if you can find that tube that the lumen has collapsed in on, that's got to be the esophagus. Okay, even right here we can see that there are distinct layers. The innermost layer is the mucosa, and then the submucosa, and then the muscularis, and then on the outer edge on this slide, the adventitia. So we're going to see different layers, and that's one thing that we're going to need to know. Now, of these slides, has everybody got one of all these slides? Hopefully, if you don't find one, you can share with somebody else. I think we usually have enough for everybody. Here's what we want to be able to do when we have our practicum next week. We want to be able to identify the organ. Identify the organ. So if I have this slide up there on the screen or on the microscope, you're going to look at that and you say, oh, that's the esophagus. Okay? So identify the organ. Next, we want to be able to identify the layers of the wall. Just like I talked my way through it. Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, serosa, or adventitia, whatever the case may be. So we want to be able to do that too. So identify the layers of the wall and identify the tissue in that layer. So in this case, the mucosa of the esophagus is stratified squamous. Remember? Stratified squamous. It's got to be tough because everything you swallow is going to slide right down through the walls there, and you want something tough. So stratified squamous. Then it gives way to the submucosa. The submucosa is going to be made up of areolar connective tissue. Remember, just about all submucosa is always areolar connective tissue. Then these layers of muscle. And the layers of muscle, remember in the esophagus it's about, in the upper third it's skeletal muscle, and in the middle third it's a mixture, and in the bottom third it's smooth muscle. Let's just go ahead and say, if I happen to ask what's the muscle layer of the esophagus, just go ahead and say smooth muscle. Let's just go ahead and make that sort of a generic response on that. And then on the outer layer here, on this very outer layer, and that's that tissue that simply ties the esophagus to whatever it's around. And that's called the adventitia, and that also is areolar connective tissue. So that's the way that I want to do the layers and the tissue within the layers. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Here's the last thing. Know the special structures that go along with each of these organs. ID the special structures. And as we go along, I'll tell you what those special structures are. Or you could simply look at your exercise handout and you'll see words there that go along with each of these organs. Okay? Like on the stomach, it's going to have gastric pits, so that'll be the special structure there. On the intestine, small intestine, it'll be villi, plicae, villi, like that. Those would be the special structures. And then on the large intestine, the crypts, the intestinal crypts, and we'll talk our way through those as we go. Okay, so here's a low power of the esophagus. And remember, I like for everybody to study all three powers. Start with low power, go to medium power, go to high power if you need to, in order to see these special structures and special cells. Okay. Then on the next slide, we simply go up in power. Now we're on high power, and you can see the mucosa of the esophagus. So remember the mucosa, outer edge here, and here's the basal layer, the innermost cell. So see how thick it is, very thick, very well colored, right? Everybody see how the color difference is between the mucosa and submucosa? Then everything here in is submucosa. Areolar connective tissue, remember it's always very loose, like spider webby type stuff. And interspersed in it, here's a big blood vessel that they've called a cross section of there, or a longitudinal section. So a lot of times you can see blood vessels in the submucosa. Okay, so that's kind of the look that goes along with that high power of the esophagus. Here's the stomach. This is under 100 power, so this would be under medium power. Once again, you can see that there's a definitive line between the mucosa and the submucosa. All of this tissue is mucosa. This whole layer here is mucosa. Now remember, the mucosa of the organs that we've talked about has 3 sub-layers. The epithelium, that's what's on the very top, and from the stomach on down, that epithelium is always going to be simple columnar. Simple columnar is the epithelium of the mucosa. Now remember, it's also got that stuff called lamina propria in it, which is kind of an areolar connective tissue filler. And then it has a thin line of muscle, smooth muscle. See this little thin line that runs right across there? That's that muscularis mucosae. But when I ask you what type of epithelium makes up the mucosa, I want you to say simple columnar. Simple columnar is always the best secretory or absorptive type of cell shape. So that's why you see so much of it in the digestive system. There's so much secretion and or digestion going on, or absorption rather, sorry. Okay, so what would all this stuff up in here be, Jonathan? What would all this be?
Wouldn't that be the muscularis? No, that's the submucosa.
That's exactly right. Under the mucosa is always going to be the submucosa, and what I say, most submucosa is areolar connective tissue. Here's some blood vessels. See these blood vessels in there? So anytime you see blood vessels, you know you're in the submucosa. Okay, now that's under 100 power. We'll go up a little bit. And here's the, no, that's still 100 power, but a different slide. Now you can start to see a better slide as far as showing these gastric pits. See these little pit-like things up here at the top? Those are the gastric pits. But the mucosa is actually that deep, right there. So all the rest of this is in little tortuous little tubes that are referred to as the gastric glands. So all of this from here up is mucosa, and that epithelium is simple columnar. It goes down here and gives way to the submucosa of areolar connective tissue down beneath. And these are the gastric pits. Here's a slide at a higher power that has those gastric pits. And so imagine now that we're looking at the very, very edge of the tissue. Here's that apical edge up here. Here's a gastric pit. Here's a gastric pit. Here's a gastric pit. So you can see those on that higher 400 power magnification. And you can see where they change from the pits up above. These are gastric glands down here. These little wiggly tubes that run down through the mucosa. Okay. Here's the small intestine. And remember, the special structure that we want to look for on the small intestine are those little finger-like things that are called villi. See these little structures right here that stick out? These are the villi. Now, on a lot of slides that we have of the duodenum and the jejunum, they have plica or plicae, if there's several of them. And what that means, of course, is there are fingers of villi that are protruding from these waves of tissue that are the plica. Okay? So this and this are, these are the plica, or plicae would be the plural of it. But these individual fingers, like you see right here, those are the villi. That would be a villus, and the plural would be villi. Right? Does that make sense? So anytime you see a villus, you've got to be in the small intestine. place they are. So you can ID that organ very quickly simply by saying, oh, I see a villus there, so that's the small intestine. Now, sometimes people get mixed up. What's a villus, what's a plica, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the country boy way to describe it. You know what a peninsula is? Peninsula sticks out like that. Think of peninsula, the plica are the peninsula, and the villi are the boat docks. Okay. All right. All right. So they go all the way down to here. From here out is mucosa. There's a thin layer of submucosa, then a fairly thick layer of muscularis, that's the muscle, and a thin outer layer here on the outside, that's the serosa. And remember, the term serosa is the same as visceral peritoneum. Remember how the peritoneum is that membrane that covers the surface? Well, the serosa is the visceral peritoneum. So it's a very thin membrane that covers the outside of the small intestine. Okay. Epithelium, simple columnar. Submucosa, areolar connective tissue. Muscularis, smooth muscle. Serosa, it's a thin membrane of areolar connective tissue and simple squamous epithelium on the outside. Okay. Here's a bigger magnification of that, and you can see a couple of things here that are important. Number one, here are the villi, but you can also see continuations of the villi that go down in between the villi like that. These are the intestinal crypts. You see these on both the large and small intestine. And so these are called the intestinal crypts, those little penetrations down into the mucosa in between the villi. Here's some pretty dramatic crypts right here, intestinal crypts that go down there. Once again, here would be everything above there would be mucosa. All of this down in here is submucosa. You can see the blood vessels and glands down in there, and so that's the point. Oh, and here's an important little feature on this. This shows up pretty good. See these little bright cells that are embedded in the epithelium? Those are goblet cells. Goblet cells. And goblet cells produce mucus all throughout the digestive system. Goblet cells are the mucus producers. And here's what they look like. If I have a simple columnar, simple columnar, simple columnar, simple columnar, and then I'll have a goblet cell, they're bigger, and they have this little clear area of mucus right in the center there. And so they stand out as being very light in their color when they're in that layer of tissue. So you can see how they stand out, those little bright spots that stand out, because that's mucus and it does not take a stain, and light passes through it very easily, and that's why they look so bright. So there's several things to know about that small intestine's life. The villi, the plica, the intestinal crypts, and the goblet cells, all of that's important. I'll put this little PowerPoint on our Canvas page too, so you can have it. And here's the large intestine. Here's the large intestine right here. Now remember, we're looking at cross sections of the wall, so don't, try to get your bearings about where we are. Up here would be the lumen of the large intestine up here. Here's the mucosa, same as we've seen before. Here's the mucosa. Here's the submucosa, and I don't see any muscularis on there, but on our slides a lot of times we'll be able to see the muscularis down below all of this. First thing, look at all of the goblet cells. I mean, the goblet cells almost outnumber all the rest of the cells, and that's because the large intestine produces lots and lots of mucus to try to put the fecal material into compact units that will move. And so goblet cells are there to do that. Also, look at the shape of these crypts. Now, these are called intestinal crypts, and they go down and up.